This episode is brought to you by Early Innings, an anthology of the first 4 years of the Twin Bill. Featuring over 200 pages of baseball poetry, short stories, essays, interviews, comics, and art, it tells the story of what it means to love baseball today. The Athletic's Tyler Kepner said, "Like a box of ballpark Cracker Jack, there's a delightful surprise on every page of the Twin Bill's Early Innings. This is a collection to be savored, a loving and lyrical celebration of the art of baseball." Early Innings is available now from 406 Press. This episode is also brought to you by Ben Shahan's Short Relief. It asks the question of what happens when men are not ready to give up that boys' game, the national pastime. In 9 stories, he traces the stories of a minor league pitcher holding on to his last shred of hope for promotion to the show, little leaguers' formative experiences, and a host of men and boys in between. Short Relief is out on 406 Press and available at 406press.com. Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolohan. We don't think of baseball as work, but baseball history is full of players fighting for and getting paid what they're worth, or fighting for just the ability to work in the majors. Andrew Forbes was on the podcast last year to talk about Mikoda's arm, and he returns now to talk about FIELDWORK, a collection of essays around labor in baseball. It's filled with some great stories, many I didn't know, and centered around the fascinating Hub Pruitt. Enjoy. Andrew, welcome back to the podcast. You are in the very exclusive two-timer club. I don't have a jacket or anything for you, but congratulations on the new book. Where does this book come from? Where's this idea start?
Thanks, first of all, Scott, for having me back. It's a pleasure to talk to you again because I had a great time last time. Where does the idea for the book come from? So a couple of things happened and nestled into my brain the way that they will. One was years and years ago, a friend gave me a postcard by an artist named Amelie Mancini. The one that I got from a friend who kind of knows my sensibilities is a ball player named Ted Wilkes, who I hadn't heard of, and most people wouldn't have, but it just says Ted Wilkes worked in a power plant. And it turns out it's from a series of postcards called Curious Second Jobs, I think, all about ball players with jobs off the field. You know, Richie Hebner was a grave digger, things like that. And so that seemed unique and interesting to me, the fact that ball players in other time periods required extra income just to make it through. And then it was the story of Hub Pruitt, Hubert Shelby Pruitt, who was a lefty pitcher for the St. Louis Browns and then a few other teams in the 1920s, and whose story, it turns out, kind of puts on its head the story that we're used to nowadays, which is that you sacrifice and strive and yearn to find a spot in professional baseball, and then you do everything you can to hold on to that. Hub Pruitt instead used baseball, which was something he just happened to be pretty darn good at, essentially as a summer job to earn money for his education. And he was explicit about the fact that once he finished his degree, he was done with pro ball. And that struck me as very, very interesting. Between those two things, I wanted to investigate how it is that we talk about people having a job playing a game.
And that's a really good point, because I don't think we really talk about Major League Baseball players as having jobs anymore. And I don't know when that disconnect started to happen. And I think it has to do with just the amount of money that they make now, where we're talking like generational money they get here for playing a kid's game, essentially. Do you have any idea when that's really started to shift, that idea?
I mean, there was that quote a few years ago famously from Anthony Rendon, who says, I do this to make a living. This is a job. But you're right. For the most part, we think of it as sort of a separate category. But the fact is, I don't know. I can't pinpoint an exact time. I think probably we're talking about the advent of free agency, when there was suddenly an open market for ball players instead of a very closed, restrictive system for compensation for professional ball players. So yeah, late 70s, I think we start to see contracts. I mean, there's going back, there's always been talk of the elite ball players, the most famous ball players, making money that seems obscene to the average wage earner. You talk about the Red Sox having the $100,000 outfield and things like that, in the 1910s. But it really is when those salaries on average become something that a regular person wouldn't recognize, is not likely to see come every 2 weeks. But the truth, as the book strives to point out, is that for the vast majority of professional ball players, for the vast history, the majority of the history of the game, it hasn't been something that was a ticket to riches. It's been something that needed to be supplemented in terms of your income.
Was this a complicated project to research here?
Not necessarily complicated. There was a great deal of volume required. So I was able to get in touch with the family of Hub Pruitt. because I really wanted him to be a central hub, if you forgive the pun, of the book. And I wanted to get his story right. So I actually did have a correspondence and a lengthy conversation with his grandson, Jamie Pruitt. But it turns out, and I think this is true in a lot of families, sometimes the family lore doesn't match the documented facts on the ground, So there were a few things that the family had believed about their own past that I, in the course of my research, like Hub Pruitt's father, I had been told, and it also appears online. There's an old ESPN article with one of Jamie's uncles. They talk about Shelby Pruitt, the grand Hub's father, being a doctor. It doesn't appear to be the case that he was a doctor. He did. What they were right about is that when Hub was about 4 or 5 years old, his father died in what they had thought was a carriage accident. I think it was probably an illness, if you read between the lines in the available documentary evidence. So there were a lot of little things that had to be worked out, but mostly it's, and it's a pleasure. I have a degree in history from university. I really enjoy getting my hands dirty with that stuff. So it was a lot of newspapers.com and genealogical research and piles and piles of digital piles of the sporting news. And that stuff is a pleasure. That's kind of why I do a lot of this, is so I can spend all that time just rolling around in that baseball history stuff. And so, yeah, it was a lot of work, but it was enjoyable work for sure.
It's funny because I've been working on a little Babe Ruth project, and I was up in the offices at the Yankee Stadium, and I was talking to the museum curator and asking him if he had any interesting Babe Ruth tidbits or anything. And he says, like, do you know Shucks Pruitt? I'm like, never heard of him. This is literally about like 2 weeks ago. So like right before
That's
your book
fantastic.
came out. I know. And I had never heard, and I was immediately like, this is a great story. How did you discover him, and what kind of drew you to Shucks?
Steve Steinberg is a great baseball researcher and biographer, and in his book on Urban Shocker, Hub is named just kind of as a throwaway, like he's just around because, of course, Shocker pitched for the Browns. He was teammates with Pruitt. And the interesting part of the story, the first most interesting part of the story, and the one that Steinberg mentions, is that Pruitt, he's an undergrad at the University of Missouri. A scout sees him, says, if you're interested in playing pro ball, come see us in St. Louis. This is a Cardinals scout. In 1920, the Cardinals and the Browns share Sportsman Park in St. Louis. In fact, it's the Browns Park, and the Cardinals are tenants. The Cardinals are on the road when he shows up. And so he wanders around, can't find anybody from the Cardinals, runs into probably Bob Quinn, who's the president of the Browns at the time. And Quinn says, well, look, if you're good enough for the Cardinals, you're probably good enough for us. Is it that you want to play pro ball for the Cardinals, or you just want to play pro ball? And Pruitt says the latter. And so he gets signed eventually. He gets signed by the Browns. So that was a neat little story. And then as I dug into his story, then you get all the other things, like the fact that for at least 2 years, he had a complete mastery of Babe Ruth. And in Pruitt's rookie year, that was very important because the Browns and the Yankees were neck and neck. And they play an absolutely crucial series in September that will essentially determine the pennant winner. Your listeners probably know the Yankees come out on top, but the Browns aren't close if not for Pruitt. But anyway, and the more you dig into his story, then you come up with the fact that he's upfront about the fact that he's only using baseball, and the fact that he can strike out Babe Ruth seemingly at will, to earn money for his education, which I thought, oh man, this is, just like you did, this is too good a story not to tell. So
yeah,
that's how I got there.
It's funny because I pulled up his baseball reference, and he had a very unremarkable career. Just like a
Extremely,
very, nothing. If you didn't know the Babe Ruth thing, you wouldn't think twice about anything he did. But it's that one skill, and it had to be against the Babe,
Completely fungible, essentially a bullpen piece in the 20s. Doesn't get that many starts. But he has this pitch. He's a lefty, and he throws a fadeaway, the same pitch that Christy Mathewson used as a righty. Ruth was upfront about it when they finally met in person in the 40s, shortly before Ruth died. When they finally spoke to one another in person, Ruth said, that pitch, if there had been more pitchers like you, nobody ever would have heard of me. Insofar as Pruitt had any renown, that was the source of it. The fact that this rather diminutive-looking lefty with otherwise fairly unremarkable numbers, just owned Babe Ruth, which is a crazy thing.
That's so great. I'm going to take it back a little bit here. So last time we had you on to talk about McCurdle's arm, and now I see the relationship between the two pieces there. Correct me if I'm wrong, McCurdle's arm essentially came out of you working on this book. Is that right?
They're definitely related. Part of researching this book, I wanted to get back into the sort of foundations of professionalism in baseball, and to do that, you're researching back into nearly the mid 19th century. So I was steeped in, I had so much research about that extremely fascinating time. Some of it conducted earlier because I was writing, a couple of earlier baseball books and reading people like John Thorne and his book, Baseball in the Garden of Eden, and Tom Gilbert's book, How Baseball Happened. There's a chance that maybe McCurdle's arm happens without the research I'm doing into Shucks, but probably not. It probably helped tip things. It gave me enough volume that I had to kind of tip my head over and pour it out. So, yeah.
When I had you on last time as well, I think I mentioned that a lot of McCurdle's arm kind of reminded me of coaching kids today and that sort of like a loose atmosphere. And so I was very excited to see that this actually comes up quite a bit in Fieldwork here. In fact, the second chapter, you start off with a story about your son getting hit or not getting hit by a pitch, which I think is a great sort of metaphor for how we view work today. I love to see the connection there with your life and a thing that we don't really think about as labor, but is a huge part of the labor that goes into baseball, the coaching, the setting up the lines. I mean, when I coach, I had a game yesterday. You got to take the tape measure out and we're setting up the bases and we're doing. There's a lot of labor that goes into this. So I was really glad to see that this was represented in your book.
Ended up being a big part of the book because, well, I'm very bad at keeping things separate, right? Like what's happening in my regular life, and there's so much, luckily there's so much baseball in my regular life that when I'm writing about baseball, the regular life spills over into it. But the deeper I got into the community of care that is around youth baseball, and as a coach, you're right in the middle of that. I couldn't not discuss it, the way that volunteerism relates to the game, and that's strange. The book is about people making money playing baseball, but there's the other half of it, which is the point, whatever the tipping point is, when you are paying to play baseball, or when you are, sacrificing and doing things that are not going to result in $1 million payday. It just speaks to how important it is to so many of us, I think, that we would forego the weekends and weeknights and hot afternoons and donate our time to making it happen.
Do the kids on your son's team, are they thinking that they are going to make money off of the game at some point here, or are they still just playing for fun right now? Or do they hope to make, is that still the dream there?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. And, I've never asked any of them directly. I suspect for most of them, I think that, one aspect of living where I do, which is, Ontario, Canada, is that hockey remains king. And most of these guys spend a lot of time in the winter training and playing hockey. And for some of them, baseball is just the summer sport. It's just the summertime filler. Some of them, I think, are maybe closer to entertaining the thought that it might be possible to get onto a D3 roster at some point and then start turning scouts' heads. And certainly there is an apparatus set up in Canada, probably not as sophisticated as the American system, but there is a youth sports industrial complex here, which is primarily geared toward hockey, but there's definitely baseball stuff too. And there are academies around Toronto, an hour and a half from here, that people pay thousands and thousands of dollars towards, and just to keep alive the idea, the notion, the faint dream that maybe something will result from it. But I wouldn't say the majority of the guys that I was coaching seriously harbored that. A dream maybe, but probably not a realistic goal.
Yeah. It's youth baseball, I think, especially, in the States here, I think has just been decimated by the perfect games, by these tournaments where you go and you pay your thousands of dollars and you try to get seen. There's very little playing for enjoyment. But if you put it the other way, if you flip it around, these are jobs now that have been created in baseball for people who wouldn't have had them. And it's a huge, huge industry now. I mean, I've charged for pitching lessons before. I've made money off of that. There is more ways to make money in baseball ever, which is also fascinating because I can tell you from working in baseball, it's a horrible profession. They tell you that it's like, oh, you're working in baseball. We're not going to pay you competitively. We're going to work you, 12 hours a day. It goes both ways. It's a very strange sport to be involved with and try to make money off of unless you're at the very top. And that's the thing that I constantly run into.
And I suspect that's true of other sports too, but baseball is the one I have the most experience with. And I think you're right. I think that there's a cynical aspect to the economy of it. I think where they know that they can bank on people wanting to be in proximity to the dream enough that they will accept terrible pay and bad conditions and precarity, which is something that I think has been a characteristic of jobs around the sport since there have been jobs around the sport.
Yeah. I have another name I wanted to mention Who's Sam Nahum? He's a fascinating character.
Fascinating character. Another pitcher. Um, Yeah, he is a guy who grows up reading books, around New York. Ashkenazi Jewish family. His father was a merchant of some kind who died when a ship went down off of the eastern seaboard. Yeah, Sam Nahum ended up getting a law degree. He ended up being a kind of a labor organizer. He ended up being a member of the Communist Party. Um, yeah, and a strange intellectual and somebody, when he was kicking around the minor leagues in a lot of these southern towns and stuff, his teammates would often they would call him Subway because he was the only actual New Yorker they'd ever met. And he was reading Baudelaire and he was reading Shakespeare on the bus and stuff. Fascinating guy and fun to dig into. And his story came to me from my editor, Andrew Faulkner, who came across Sam Nahum somewhere and slipped me his Sabre bio and said, "Look at this guy. What do you think of that?" And knowing that I would be unable to resist taking that bait and researching more and writing about him. But yeah, fascinating guy. Ends up moving out to the West Coast. He worked in chemical plants. He was active in the union. Upon retirement, he volunteered his time at the Art Museum, I think, in Berkeley. Not things you normally associate with ball players, but fascinating guy.
No, I loved hearing about him.
Yeah.
He was one of my favorites. Yeah. I know, so you are a Blue Jays fan. I know that I don't know how I would describe what their role in free agency has been over the last couple years. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if they're just being used or if they're just a prop or what, or if they're really being given consideration. I have no feel for that. You do talk about the Ohtani plane ride because in theory, this is a very good thing for these players that they can now make this money because of guys like Curt Flood and before that. And yeah, it's constantly painted in this kind of like, oh my gosh, $700 million, he's not worth it. Or recently, finally, I'm so happy that Vlad Jr. signs his $500 million deal. So one, for you as a Blue Jays fan, how do you feel about this role the Blue Jays have played? And in a sort of a context of like the labor situation, how do you feel about the way that this has all unfolded for these players and particularly with the Blue Jays?
It's complicated, Scott. When players are rumored to be, when big name players, your Ohtanis, your Sotos, are rumored to be coming to Toronto, and the money appears to be there because Toronto is a big player in terms of they're owned by a massive corporation with seemingly bottomless reserves of cash. They draw fans and therefore money and streaming subscriptions from all corners of Canada. It's a massive area. They are a big market team. So it makes sense that they're part of these conversations. The moment when we learn that Soto goes to the Mets, Ohtani goes to the Dodgers, for longtime Blue Jays fans and maybe Canadians in general, that triggers the kind of inferiority complex that we're always kind of living with, where we want to be validated. As Blue Jays fans, you come again and again up against this hard reality that maybe the people just are not willing to go to Canada, even though all that money is there. And I know that there are extra layers to this. There's, the tax situation and things like that, the relative value of the Canadian dollar and how that fluctuates against the US dollar and all these things. I get it. But it really all of a sudden feels like, won't somebody notice us and treat us as the big league hound that we aspire to be? And yeah, when it comes to Vlad and his $500 million, it gets difficult to defend that much money going to somebody who, as you said, plays a kid's game. But we live in a capitalist system, and a capitalist system rewards demand, right? Enough money for these players to earn this money. And I'll remind you, in a very, very, for the most part, small earning window. And your Rogers corporations and your Guggenheim, who owns the Dodgers, these companies would not be signing these contracts if it didn't make financial sense for them. There is money to be made. They will come out ahead in the end. I can tell you from going to Blue Jays games that 70% of the jerseys that people pay $200 a pop for have got Vladdy's name on them. So they're going to be just fine. I'm glad he's here. Like I kept saying, I don't care what it takes. It's not my money. And that may even be, when you're signing a 14-year contract, that may in fact be the opinion of the GM and the president as well, because they are probably not going to be there by the end of that contract when it starts to look pretty lousy. No, get the man his flowers. He's a great ball player, and his smile some nights is the best reason to tune into a Jays game, when they're losing 2 out of 3 to the Mariners this weekend. Like, well, at least Vladdy looked like he's having fun. Now that I know that I can look forward to that for the next decade and a half, I feel okay about it.
You kind of touch on almost like the flip side of that, where with Albert Pujols, who he was so good. He was just maybe the best hitter. I mean, Bonds is up, but like maybe the best hitter I ever saw. And for me as a Tigers fan, Miguel Cabrera is in the same sort of boat there too, and they both just for the last decade or so, they were not that player after they signed these huge deals. I think Miggy got a little bit of a pass because he stayed in Detroit, but I think that people in Anaheim weren't necessarily thrilled with Albert Pujols. It's strange because we don't think about ourselves in these terms like, oh, I'm getting older, I shouldn't be able to do what I used to do, and somehow we see these players, they hit 33 and they start falling off, and we're like, oh, he's old, he's cooked, he's done, get him out of, we don't like him anymore. It's interesting. We just don't view it in the same way. Do you have any concept of why that is, or how we view work versus how we view work as ball players?
It's a great question. First of all, with Pujols, his body might be a strange one upon which to base that argument, which is that, that the inevitable breakdown of organic tissue has effects on how people play a sport. And his numbers are so grotesque as it is. They're so huge. It's hard to feel sorry for someone who hit 600 home runs. But you have to conclude that if he'd remained healthy, he might be at the top of all those leaderboards, right? So it's interesting. But yeah, and this is tied to the Vladdy conversation. Miguel Cabrera, I think, is a great comparison too. I've got a friend who's a Tigers fan who said the end of that Guerrero deal is going to start looking a lot like the Cabrera the last few. And I thought, I'd take that, and that's the cost of doing business. And I think as a fan, you just kind of get used to it now, where you recognize that there are things that a player has earned through his performance, and there are things that teams have to do to secure the services of a player in his prime. And that includes overpaying him, I'm using air quotes, at the end of it, right? It used to be that players, with the reserve system, the reserve clause, a select few players who had good relationships with their team owners would be paid based on their past laurels, just as a kind of feel-good thing, and thanks for what you've done. But for the most part, these deals now are for most players, we're structuring deals so that we are paying for that sweet spot, for the performance. There is an echelon of players, and Vlad Guerrero is among them, for whom the cost of doing business for these teams is more than that. We know he's probably not going to be effective, or nearly as effective at 35 years old, but we're going to have to take that. We're going to have to swallow it. And I think that as we talk about that narrow earning window that a baseball player has, I think that really is one of the successes of the free agent movement and of Curt Flood's efforts and Marvin Miller and the Players Association, securing a little bit of security for players. And that's, if you prove it enough at the early part of your career, that's what it buys you. I don't know if it's hard to imagine there being any retraction of these things in future agreements between the Players Association. I know that that's the ground that the players don't want to cede, but that the owners would love to see go away, right?
Yeah.
But there's no putting the toothpaste back in the tube when it comes to structuring deals like they used to, right? Where they could tell you basically, this is what we think you're worth, and you have the choice of retiring or taking it. So this is where we've gotten to.
How do you feel about the current relationship between labor and baseball today? It sounds like there might be an impending work stoppage coming up here.
Like we're heading toward it. It sounds like we're heading toward it. It's a necessarily adversarial relationship between the two, right? Because they're pulling in opposite directions, and I get that. I mean, I know that they share the common goal of improving the game and its reach, and therefore the money that it brings in, but there's always going to be tension between, an owner wants to maximize their profit and a player wants to maximize his earning. So, even in the most cordial of times since the dawn of the Players Association in the 60s, I don't think you'll ever eliminate that tension. And I think that it's necessary. When these deals are due for renewal, we've had time for grievances to build up on both sides. I think the players are right that there should be a salary floor. I would listen to arguments that the owners have to make for a salary ceiling. But I think there's a lot of other things in there. Rob Manfred has shown a willingness as commissioner to really do the owner's bidding, which is his job. I mean, that's always been the case for the commissioners, going all the way back to Kennesaw Mountain Landis. But they've worked together on a few things, specifically around the strange COVID season and things that had to be done there. But I also think that some of the things that were put in as temporary measures, it's time for them to go. So I understand the players gearing up for a work action, because I think that you're right. I'm hearing the same thing, and it won't be surprising.
Yeah. Well, Andrew, a pleasure as always. Write some more baseball books, and we'll have you back again. You can be the first three-timer.
There's better be a jacket for that.
That was Andrew Forbes. His book, Fieldwork, on baseball and making a living, is out now. Coming on to close us out is Carol Mikoda, reading her poem Remembrance from our 19th issue.
Remembrance. You taught me how to catch a high fly ball. You took me to the backyard with our gloves. You tossed the ball straight up with all your strength. You coached me. Put the glove up. Watch the ball. You laughed at me when I was scared to look, but then I looked. The ball came smashing down. My glasses ripped into my eyebrow. Blood dripped down my cheek. My eyes, wide in surprise, were wet with red as I lay on the ground. You laughed and cried and drove me to St. Joe's. The stitches healed. The scar is up there still, unnatural parting of my right eyebrow. You say I could forget you if I tried, but every mirror shows that you were here.
We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twin Bill Literary Journal. Until next time,